All right, we are now live for another political theory and practice discussion. The topic that I picked for this month is a little bit, you might say, obscure in how it's titled, but hopefully people will, catch on to what I'm talking about as we're going through it. And it's the unraveling of political norms. Now, I'm going to be talking specifically about political norms, but we could apply this to other areas as well that are, you could say, politicized, like education, the economy, daily interactions with people. So I'll talk about that in a bit. And this is going to, I think, seem kind of far ranging. I'm going to be bringing in a number of different thinkers at different points, not because I have some absolutely well worked out systematic approach to this, but because I find them helpful myself. And I'll try to do as much explaining as I can do in bringing them up, not assuming that people have all read them. So I'm going to begin in a way that might seem a little simplistic and schematic by bringing up an essay by Gilles Deleuze about Herman Melville's Bartleby the Scrivener, and in significant part about Melville's ideas in his works, and also what this, by the end of the essay, Deleuze is talking about things, Russia, America, pragmatism, all sorts of other things as well. And we don't need to focus on every single aspect or element of it. The essay is called Bartleby or the Formula, and the formula that's being referred to there is the I would prefer not to. And actually, it occurs to me that might come up later on as something that is worth talking about. But what I'm going to say that I particularly like about Deleuze's essay, and it struck me even when I was a graduate student years and years and years ago, is that it has to do not specifically with norms as such, but with what Deleuze calls the law, which could encompass norms, ways of articulating how we ought to be doing things, including sanctions for those things as well. Who should be rewarded, who should be punished, why, how should we control people? And Deleuze talks about there being three types of what he calls originals as opposed to just plain old characters. And this is in Melville, but I think we could apply this to other things as well. So two are at antipodes to each other, and you could view them as active and passive, also evil, and in a certain respect good, but also kind of a sickly sort of goodness. The vulnerable. So let's start with them. Bartleby himself is a messed up character. He clearly cannot function well in the law office that he's in, and the attorney is trying to get to draw something out of him to get him to be integrated into the office. Billy Budd would be another good example of this. And, Billy Budd ends up, being it starts out being a damaged character, but also kind of an angelic character, and meets a terrible end as well. And these are people who are going to be not just vulnerable, but also, you could say, victimized, right? And you could say, well, why does that happen? And so let's swing to the other end. We have Ahab as a representative of this other demonic type, this megalomaniac, as Deleuze calls him. Claggart, the master of arms, and Billy Budd, who has it in for Billy Budd. And these are the people who are sadistic. They are driven. They won't accept limitations. They don't work well with others, and they try to dominate, right? And so you could say, well, the real problem in society is that, these mean people are doing bad stuff to the vulnerable people. And that there's something true there, right? And so what should restrain them but doesn't restrain them? Here's where we get to the third kind that Deleuze calls prophets. So the captain in Billy Budd, or the attorney in Bartleby the Scrivener. These are people who see the problematics of human society and human interactions, and they stand for the law with a capital L. They are there to exercise power, in order to keep order going. And why is order a good thing? Order is supposed to be there to restrain the a-holes, Ahab the a-hole, right? And to protect the vulnerable and keep things operating. This is not a unique idea, of course. Read St. Augustine and you will see all sorts of great discussions about the need for order. Aristotle talks about this. Plato talks about this. This is a constant of political theory that we cannot do altogether without order. There is, of course, an anarchist tradition, anarchism, if you think about it, no rule, right? People ruling themselves, but that's at the fringes primarily. Most of the time we live in societies in which there are some orderings, and the orderings can be good. J.B. Bell brings up Martin Luther King talking about order versus justice. Most of the time, order is supposed to be enshrining justice. So it's not so simple as a dichotomy between order and justice. We see something similar in John Stuart Mill as well. We've got the forces of order and conservatism versus the forces of order and progress. Progress is order too. It's a reordering. What Martin Luther King is talking about, order as well, but a just order as opposed to an unjust order. So there's always order there. Now, here's the problematic that Deleuze identifies. The jerks, the a-holes, the people who, are so dynamic and attractive, but are ultimately, driven by passions that tend to be bad. They not only do they not respect the order, they tear through it like rocks through spider webs. And the order that's there actually ends up falling much more severely onto those who are more vulnerable to it and should be protected by it and aren't. So we could think in our own time about the use of policing, and we've talked about this before in political theory and practice discussion, several of them. American policing, and it's a mess because there is no national organized policing thing. Even if you have something like that, go ahead and look at the British Met, and you can see that policing can be corrupt and misogynistic and problematic in many ways. But we don't even have that. Instead, we just have a whole bunch of police departments and sheriff's departments and, state police troopers and all these sorts of things, kind of at each with their own little fiefdom, and oftentimes victimizing the very people that they are supposed to serve and protect. Sometimes we have these terrible figures within the police. We see these awful revelations of, things. The Chicago Police Department is a particularly egregious example, where they even have places to take people so that they don't have to book them and they can torture them instead of booking them and stuff like this, along those lines. But we have that happening here in Milwaukee with police who are out of control. We recently had a police officer fired after he'd killed 3 people. From the Wauwatosa Police Department, and then immediately hired by the Waukesha Sheriff's Department. So this is a serious issue. Those who are supposed to be doing the protecting and guiding may not be helping out those who are vulnerable. They may be just serving order itself, and they're like, "Oh, it's unfortunate, but I got to do bad stuff to you." Or they may be the bad actors themselves. And this isn't just a matter of policing. This can be a matter of government. This can be a matter of education. This can be a matter of hospitals. Really, any place where we have power relations, this is an issue. Theoretically, the sound has a tendency to be unequal. I don't control that. People like to bring that sort of stuff up. YouTube automatically controls the sound. Don't weigh in about stuff that's irrelevant to the actual topic. All right, so returning, we could say not everything is the way Deleuze is depicting it. Maybe that's a little bit too pessimistic, right? So maybe there is a social order that exists, and it's not just about protecting order or protecting the vulnerable or making sure resources are shared. Maybe it is about political contestation. Maybe it is about how people representing different classes, different groups, different, whatever we have within society can, make their claims and articulate what needs to happen and jockey with each other. That is politics. And we can never fully get away from politics. Some great political theorists have recognized that, ranging from Aristotle all the way up to, Hannah Arendt and Jürgen Habermas. There will always be competing interests. And there will not only always be competing interests, there will always be competing conceptions of what the right thing to do is, what the right arrangement is. And, we're probably, you can get away from that by superimposing one particular point of view, but that's usually going to be unjust. And that's going to victimize an awful lot of people who are supposed to be, if we want to use the police motto, protected and served by the order that is put in place. Now, so all that background, here's where we get to the topic that I wanted to bring up. Here in America, I'm an American. I've been observing American politics really since I was in grade school, and we saw the Reagan versus Carter election. My dad was a big fan of Gary Hart. We had civics classes in school, so I've been observing what's been going on for a long time, and I've participated as a voter and sometimes as an advocate in politics. One of the things that I've observed happening over not just the last presidential reign of Trump or anything like that, but over decades, is the gradual unraveling of political norms. And we call this like hyper-partisanship, right? We call this factionalization or, things along those lines. But it really also, at the ground level, represents a saying, I know the norm is this, but in this case, I'm going to do this because that is for the benefit of those I represent or my party or something like that. That's the right thing to do. And I've seen both parties, here in America, we have the Republicans and we have the Democrats. I've seen both parties doing this in the past, like with how they carry business out in the Senate, which is a rather cumbersome institution, or the use of executive decision making to override legislative decision making on the part of the presidents and all the different agencies that we have. And it's been going on for quite a while, this unraveling, this abrogating, this making exceptions to what should be political norms that would protect the process and would keep things from getting so hyper partisan. I would say that we've reached a kind of tipping point a while back. And at this point in time, I would say that there are some people on the left and identified with the center left Democrat Party, maybe not even center left, maybe just center Democrat Party, who certainly have a role in this, right? If you're prioritizing things in such a way that you're willing to engage in domestic terrorism, you are clearly, or you're calling for domestic terrorism, you are clearly crossing political lines and going against any sort of order that would be not just your order, but an order that would, sort of govern how things would work, right? And I would say the Republican Party and the conservatives, who aren't even conservative anymore, a lot of them are just straight out fascists or authoritarians. They're not conservative in the sense of conserving what conservatism was like 40 years ago, except for the lunatic fringe. They're doing much worse. When we see calls to not just say impeach a legislature or a executive, but to go and kill them, that's a clear line that's been crossed. When we see people within the political establishment countenancing this and advocating this, which is, quite often the case, and those who resist them within their party being censured, being silenced. I mean, that's the real cancel culture there, right? We've got a serious, serious problem. And it's a problem that, I don't belong to either party. Right. And I voted for and against both parties over the course of my time. oftentimes voting against the worse evil against the lesser evil. Those of us who are not affiliated with the party, those who we call independents, we're screwed too by this failure for our government to actually work, both at the federal level and at the state level. The state that I live in here, Wisconsin, is a great example of that. And it's more of a thing to blame the Republicans for than the Democrats. The Republicans seem really cool with trying to have power for the sake just of power and to rule as a minority over all the rest of us, the majority. By the way, the Democrats were doing crap like that back in the early 2000s as well, and so it's not as if they were the only people doing that. But this is a very problematic thing. And if we get away from just party politics, this gets us to the point where maybe people are like, none of this shit works. I'm not going to worry about either party. I need to protect my interests. I need to protect myself against all these other people, because the political norms are indeed unraveling. And they're not just unraveling within the political processes and institutions, which have been corrupt and rotten for a very long time. Lobbying, these two parties, they've been totally flush with cash for a very long time. The culture war stuff that we're engaging in, most of the content in the culture war is pretty deleterious to any sort of functioning society. And we could talk about how this affects education, where we've got crazy people coming into school board meetings and textbooks being now banned if they have any mention of our the history of race in America. We have a lot of problematic areas. This factionalization has affected dating, it's affected families, it's affected workplaces, all these sorts of things. If we don't improve this in some way, then the bad actors won't, when they get emboldened, when they see that there's no sanctions for what they do, when they see that there are laws in place and they're not applied, when we know that there are, for example, regulatory agencies which then are underfunded, so they can't actually go out and do their work. And this is a big, big thing going on in the Trump administration. Think about the FDA turning over, for example, to the pork industry, its own checking up on itself. Terrible idea, for a political community. It's basically letting the bad actors do whatever they want to do. That demoralizes the hell and angers the hell out of everybody else who's not getting to feed at the trough, right? And it also leaves out all those other people, to go back to the Deleuze thing, who are vulnerable, who don't understand how to make the system work, who are at risk of being, having power, what there is of order, used against them. And we live in a society in which that is very often the case. There are a lot of victimized groups. There are a lot, not just for right now, but historically for generations. So do I have any solution to this? I don't. I'm just sort of, throwing something out there that I've been thinking about and troubled by and observing. I will say this, that when it comes to this victimization, you could talk about one of the responses that somebody could have is like, it's all nice for you to talk about order and stuff like that. My group, my people have not been protected by that order for a very long time. And that's right. If we think about race, for example, Alexis de Tocqueville, back in the 19th century, in the 1840s, in his book, Democracy in America, which is very bullish about America, which says American democracy and society is offering us something new and robust. He's got a chapter where he says, the great sin of America, and they're going to have to figure this out, is what they've done to the black and the red race, meaning Africans and Native Americans. That was back in the 1800s. People were seeing this. It's not something radically new. It is an integral part of our history. I would suggest that, anybody who thinks that there's like a social contract that covers everybody should probably read, Charles Mills' The Racial Contract. That's a good work to think about. We could think about gender, and we could think about sexuality, and we could think about poverty, and all these things intersecting with each other. We could think about all the other ways in which power winds up being used on people. And maybe somebody like Foucault could be very helpful in helping us see that. And maybe people like, if we want to reconstruct something decent, maybe we would bring in theorists like Habermas or Arendt or whoever else we can bring to the table. But again, I don't have a solution to this. I just see a big looming problem. And I'll finish by bringing in Hobbes. I've got my anti-Leviathan shirt here. Thomas Hobbes is often misunderstood with his whole state of nature and then the sovereign thing. He does bring that up. That's a rhetorical construct. Hobbes was worried about something happening again in England, like the English Civil War that he lived through, where people were contesting not just who was going to have power, but what made power legitimate? What made things okay or not okay? And when you've got people who can't agree on the fundamentals of what would be just or unjust, let alone facts about things like, is wearing masks a good idea for preventing COVID, right? Or do vaccines contain microchips that allow Bill Gates to control my mind? We're in bad territory, right? There's a tendency to devolve into a Hobbesian dynamic, which is never a pure state of nature. It's rather factionalized society in which war gets carried on within that society. And when we have people calling for a new American Civil War, we're clearly close to the Hobbesian point of view, aren't we? So that's enough that. We'll see how many relevant things we have here. William Zen, any thoughts on how you managed Singapore? Do you think a virtue ethicist could have supported him? I don't know enough about Singapore to weigh in on that. And I don't know, maybe a virtue ethicist could, maybe a virtue ethicist couldn't, but I don't know how that's particularly relevant to this one. JB, our RCMP, Royal Canadian Mounted Police in Canada, has a very bad problem with sexism and other bigotries. Here it's more of the native people who get horribly maltreated. Yeah, Canada has, at this point in time, an equally terrible record. I'm actually ashamed to say, as somebody whose family is French Canadian, and knowing the different paradigm that the French had for a very long time in relations with Native Americans or First Peoples, that the Quebecois have treated the people that they deal with, like the Mohawk, like crap as well, right? So this is a significant problem, and one of the great examples of what's going on. So that this trucker, whatever you want to call it, right? I would call it trucker riots. I wouldn't call them strikers. I would call it, outside agents for the most part, and people who are rich enough to be able to take 2 weeks off of work and, park their truck somewhere and, wave their flags and all that sort of stuff. Whatever we want to call it, people are noticing that when it came to blocking pipelines, the police were there on the spot, ready to crack heads. And they're not there for these people who are really, placing cities in a state of siege and screwing up the economy. There's a disjunction there, right? When you look at that, you're like, the political order is really helping out some people, and these are clearly bad actors. You start looking into it. The PayPal is used for money laundering. We could go on and on and on. And people who are trying to protect the environment and say, hey, don't put a pipeline on our land, they get the stick, they get the water cannon. There's something really off about that, right? Francis, what do you think of the abolition of work? I don't think that's going to happen. That's a non-starter, right? Where do you see that as something that's likely to occur in the situations that we live in our lifetime. I mean, we could say there might be an abolition of work in the sense that work gets taken away from everybody because of AI and our incredibly complex logistics system and robotics and stuff like that, which then just enriches the people who own all that sort of stuff. And we wind up, we can think about Marx, right? And Marx is actually right on a lot of things. Certain types of industrial processes combined with capitalist processes sometimes produce the state where the worker doesn't have any work, right? That's very different than being in like a post-scarcity future, which I don't see happening in America anytime. Chess the Alley Cat, thanks for speaking up. I'm a socialist in general. Yeah, I mean, socialists here in the United States, there's not a hell of a lot of them to begin with, but they get this socialist slur against them because conservatives for I don't know how far do we go back? Really, the whole 20th century and our century have been like using it as a slur term. So very few people who actually are against socialism know what the hell socialism even means. But we could talk about third-party positions or third-party perspectives. They're like totally shut out of our political processes. I mean, you could say the libertarians have a little bit of edge with the Republicans, but not much, So, all right, Max, wouldn't you feel that a city like Chicago's police department wouldn't be given any credence at home nor at Washington to reduce strict behavior aggressive to any or all criminals? I don't know what that means. I'm not sure what you're asking there. Given credence to reduce strict behavior aggressive to any. I mean, here's the point. Chicago PD is pretty corrupt, right? It's been corrupt for a long time. There's a lot of people who are, I would say, objectively evil individuals existing within its ranks, and there's no accountability. I mean, and the mayor, who should be doing something about it, she backs them up most of the time, right? So Chicago's in a bad way. It's kind of funny because you get these like outsiders who are like, oh, look at Chicago, guns everywhere, people are shooting each other, it's so bad. You know why it's bad? It's bad because criminals aren't being dealt with, and the cops are so so much basically knee-jerk right-wing conservative kill happy people that they're not going to do anything about it. Really, they love the status quo. Whenever you see people from the outside of a city criticizing that city and they don't know much about it, just take it for granted that they're getting fed something by media and politicians that identify with their side, and they don't know what the fuck they're talking about. You want to know what's going on in Chicago, you got to follow Chicago news. You got to know some people that are actually on the ground. Same thing with Milwaukee, right? Chicago and Milwaukee, not the same thing, So, I mean, I wouldn't like say a lot about Baltimore police because I don't know. So, all right. Chess the Alley Cat. I think Rawls is more important than ever right now. Yeah, I mean, a lot of Rawls stuff is kind of non-starters, though. It's interesting. If you think about the veil of ignorance experiment, when we actually do this in classes, I've found it never pans out the way that Rawls says it's going to. Maybe that works for like students at Harvard back in the 1960s and 70s and 80s. It sure as hell didn't work for students in Southern Illinois in the late 90s, or my prison students in Indiana State Prison in the early 2000s, or my other students in New York and here in Milwaukee when I proposed it in the late 2000s and the 2010s. So and Rawls is quite complex to read. It's not like you can take his thoughts and easily present and condense them. So I don't know. I don't see Rawls as really all that helpful. But if things were better, maybe he would be, right? That might actually be a sign of like the disconnect between academically informed political theory and what's actually happening within our society. Mark says, I was having an interesting discussion with a student earlier about the difference between the failure of the state versus that of the government, how to discriminate between them. This is a really great question. And I think we could actually say not just the failure of this is kind of Aristotelian, the state and the government, or actually Aristotle would say the politeia, right? The constitution, and then the regime, the people who are actually in charge. We can make distinctions between them, right? We make distinctions every election when we vote the current set of bozos out and we bring a new set of hopefully not bozos in. Bozo, by the way, was Bozo the Clown, so that's kind of an American slang thing of a certain generation. Bozo the Clown, by the way, is from Chicago. I used to get to watch that when I was a kid, if the weather was just right so the antenna could actually pick it up. So, in a way, in functioning democracies, we already do make a distinction between the state or the mode of governance, right, and the people doing it. What we're seeing is that the middle part, the institutions that get things done, that get politics working, that allocate funds, those are starting to be torn apart and be usurped for purely partisan ways, right? And that's really problematic. Now, it's unfortunate that we have to wait until, like, when it comes to presidents, we don't have like a vote of no confidence where we can say, get this a-hole out of here. They're not doing a good job. I mean, even if we did, of course, then we'd have constant lobbying by whoever's in the opposition to do that. I mean, that's basically what the Republicans tried to do to Obama, isn't it? As soon as he came in, and a lot of this was driven, clearly just by racism. They were like, this guy is not going to be able to do anything. We're not going to work with him on anything. He's a socialist. He's a Barack Hussein Obama. He's a Islamic catalyst. He's for Black liberation theology. They just make all sorts of bullshit up, right? But they didn't want to work with him on anything. And the Democrats had enough power at that time to push things through, but they managed to lose control over a lot of the states at the same time. So, there's a good example of, the opposition was totally against that regime, and they wanted to, as soon as they got in power, they wanted to use that politeia, they wanted to use the apparatus of power for whatever they wanted to do. And, you notice too with the Biden regime, it's a big disappointment to a lot of people who wanted Trump out, because Biden is doing a lot of the same stuff. And there's the same thing with Obama, right? When it comes to not foreign policy in some respects. I mean, Trump was like, there's not a dictator that Trump wouldn't kiss the ass of, right? So that's a little bit different. But when it comes to like continuing the war on terror and military budgets and all this sort of stuff, the Biden regime is not that different than the Trump regime, except in, the cruelty being done in different ways. And we could say the same thing about the Bush regime to the Obama regime, drone strikes, for example, right? So sometimes there's an important, it seems like there's a difference, but there's a real continuity there between regimes, because the politeia requires that. We could think about America as a weird, unique, dangerous case, the hyperpower, as we were called in the 90s and early 2000s, where we have this massive military force that we can project. And, we still have a lot of economic force as well. And so we're in kind of an unusual case. And, maybe to the detriment of, I won't say the rest of the world, because I mean, do you really want the Chinese in charge or the Russians in charge? Maybe not, right? LC, regulatory agencies are captured. Yeah, that often happens. I mean, here in America, unfortunately, another issue that we have is regulatory agencies, the ones that are doing a lot of the heavy lifting, you could say, right? You get a bad person in there as a political appointee, and then it's tough to get them out, especially now when our political decision making about who to appoint to positions is extremely partisan. We got that prime example, that terrible postmaster general Joy. Why couldn't they just kick him out? Well, it takes a lot to do. Let's see. JB Bell says not so much quis custodet custodes, who's guarding the guardians, right? As ubi custodes, where are the guardians? I mean, in some respect, we got too many guardians, right? We got too many people jockeying for I want to be the guardian, and most of them are shitty guardians. They're in it for themselves. They're in it for their party. They're not really, here's where again we could bring in a great Aristotelian distinction. What differentiates a monarchy from a tyranny? It doesn't differentiate it on the basis of one person rule or an aristocracy and oligarchy. It's not just that it's the rich versus the good, it's the who is being looked out for. If you are a monarch in a real sense, a basileus, right? Then you look out for the entirety of the society, including even perhaps criminals. You don't just say, well, they're the enemies, so let's kill them all. You say, how can we work things out together so that the common good, which has got to be not just a common good of like the nation as a whole or the state as a whole, but good of the people involved in it. How do we make that happen? Whereas the tyrant is like me, 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 and those who kiss my butt. Everybody else, screw them. And Aristotle talks about the difference between two types of what we would call democracy, right? Where the many rule. In some cases, it's the many ruling, and they're actually looking out for the rest of society, not just their own interests, not just their own party, not just their own race, their own class, whatever we want to pick. And then there's the greedy, I only care about myself. Prime example of this are all the people who, have changed their position on COVID because somebody close to them died, right? They're like, until then, they're like, it's all a hoax. Screw all the immune compromised people. We don't want this. This is going against freedom. And then suddenly somebody close to them dies and like, now I get it. Well, no, you didn't get it. You didn't work for the common good. You only care about yourself and your little class or your little group. That's what Aristotle thinks democracy often devolves into. And if democracy is going to actually work, it can't look like that. It's got to be this other kind over here where there can be some self-interest, there can be some partisanship, but that better not be running the show. Parties better be able to work together. And that's not the case here. Hasn't been the case for a long time. Chesty the Alley Cat, you get tangled up in a group's rhetoric and it inhibits you from seeing things clearly, very emotive. Yeah, I would say a lot of the people who are tied in and very passionate about party politics right now have been suckered. There's some great articles out there about how Trump essentially and the Trump regime essentially were a bunch of scammers, con men. And the one thing that a person who's been conned will not do in most cases is recognize that they've been conned. And it's a really sad part of that. In this case, unfortunately, we had to, have thousands of people, well, million, at this point worldwide, millions of people, hundreds of thousands of Americans die due to something that could have been taken care of. Our COVID response, almost counterproductive from the federal level during the Trump regime, and it enabled people at the state level to do all sorts of crazy crap as well. If this had been happening during Reagan's administration, you can bet that there would have been mask mandates across the board. We would have been working for universal inoculation. None of this crazy bullshit would have been tolerated, but that, we're in a different place now. So Kirkland Day, what do you think about the conflict of the West versus Russia and China? I think it's been going on for a while. What's new to report, right? We've got some jockeying. We've got some turning, countries into proxies and stuff like that going on. We have different ways of looking at things. It's very clear that as opposed to like if this had been happening in the 60s or 70s, China is driving the car. Russia is just sort of like along for the ride. Russia is, Russia is not going to do well going forward. You look at the society, negative growth rates, right? An economy that's just a hot mess, the need to engage in jingoism, clearly non-free press. China is on the rise. I mean, there's a lot of problems in China, including some that aren't all that well known, but um, China is going to be a major player in this century. So Mox says Tocqueville definitely ahead of his time, probably centuries into the future, definitely beyond today's current age. Yeah, I guess so. I mean, I think de Tocqueville is kind of undeservedly neglected, and he's been kind of ceded over to middle road conservatives who want to talk about American exceptionalism. And I think one of the things that they forget is that de Tocqueville is identifying this as in the America of the 1840s. There's no guarantee that the dynamics that he saw last, right? Maybe America is quite different than what de Tocqueville was identifying as opposed to European democracies. And maybe some other places are more de Tocquevillian in that respect than current America is, right? So, all right. JB, appropriate to invoke the English Civil War because people in the USA talking about Civil War don't appreciate it. It would be more like that one. Oh, yeah, this is a very interesting point. It would be more like the English Civil War and not like the American Civil War from history. Yeah, I mean, the American Civil War itself was very complicated. There's a lot of people who are like, well, you had the North and the South, and it wasn't about slavery, it was about states' rights, and when I was in high school, one of the standard essays that we had was identify the 11 causes of the American Civil War. And number one was slavery, right? But there were all sorts of other things going on as well. And the Southerners not only enslaved blacks, they also indentured a lot of whites as well, usually poor whites, made them work basically as slaves. There were rebellions against the South in a lot of different places that had to be crushed by Southern troops. There were, states that were considered not in rebellion, even though they weren't really supporting the Union, like Missouri and Kentucky, right? There were other states like Wisconsin. One of the things that I'm very proud of here in our heritage is which we've kind of lost sight of, unfortunately, especially if you go out into the countryside, is anti-racism and abolitionism. This was one of the most, committed states to those causes. And we contributed more than our fair share of soldiers to the American Civil War as a result, So that you've already got a complicated American Civil War. The English Civil War was similarly driven by ideological perspectives and the breakdown of that society, the breakdown of the political community, you could say. That's why Hobbes writes Leviathan. He sees this, and I don't want to say his solution is the right one, but it's we should take a look at it, and we should think about others. We could also look at other societies that are closer in time where social breakdown occurs and ask, why is that the case? I think anybody who talks about a national divorce or a civil war in positive terms, if our society was functioning well, we would censure them. We would say, get the hell out of here because you don't belong at the table. If you're going to be playing around with this sort of stuff, you don't get to talk like the adults, So, all right. LC, do you see an era of multipolarity emerging at the geopolitical level? Maybe we're seeing the start of a similar dispersion at home, less Dem and Republican, more diverse coalitions. So 2 different questions there. I would say it would be wonderful if we had more diverse coalitions. Unfortunately, the Republican and the Democratic parties have a complete lock on American politics all the way down to the local level. There are a few exceptions, like there's some libertarians in Texas and Indiana, but the libertarians tend to caucus with the Republicans anyway. So who cares, right? You're just a Republican by a different name. It's interesting to see how the libertarians who are all about freedom are super cool with fascism, so long as it's directed not at them but against, say, black people. The other parties, the Green Party, there's really not much of it going on. I don't see it as a viable party, or the Constitution Party, or any of the other parties that are that are around as well. So I don't see a lot of coalition politics going on, unfortunately, unless your coalition happens to have money, right? Because that's really what drives this the most. And it's the donations are being made by big think tanks, big philanthropists, and by corporations. For every Soros, there's a cock, right? And then you've got all these corporations that are spending oftentimes on both sets of candidates. I don't see that changing. I wish it could change, but I don't see that changing. Now, at the geopolitical level, very different, right? We clearly have a waning of U.S. influence, in part because we piss away so much of our budget on a military, trying to stay strong, not realizing that this position is not going to last forever, and we're impoverishing ourselves at home. I mean, the other powers are in effect doing to us what we did to the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union collapsed in part because it couldn't deliver on economic promises and promises about culture to its people, and it couldn't do that because they were spending so much of their money on the military, preparing for World War III. We instead of preparing for World War III, prepare for all this asymmetric warfare and bombing the shit out of people with carrier groups, and that's extraordinarily expensive, and continual drone warfare and things like that, right? And that's unsustainable. So we will eventually shift to a multipolar sort of thing in international relations. The question is, who are the poles going to be? Clearly China, right? Probably Russia. I mean, although Russia's sort of like what Turkey was like, the sick man of Europe in leading up to World War I, right? Clearly the United States and clearly the EU. Whether Britain will play a major role remains to be seen. India is also a significant player. Brazil has the opportunity, if they ever get their collective crap together, which may not happen because of all the political infighting and the incredible poverty. They could become a major power. They have the potential to do so. Iran, perhaps. Iran is a regional superpower. Saudi Arabia is a regional superpower as well, but will they be so when the oil runs out? Maybe not. So there's a lot of possibility for a multipolar, and we're talking about like probably when I'm an old man and dying, and some of you are that as well, and some of you are young people in your middle age. It's not going to happen like tomorrow, but there's a good chance for it. Giovanni Soda, not a real question. Just wanted to say I'm preparing my dissertation on human delusions, and your video on them are great help. Oh, glad that you find them helpful. I always like to see, attention to the text, and I'm sure that you're reading the text, so that's great. Here we have somebody who wants to contest things. Trucker riots. Watch some of the live streams. It's one of the nicest protests I've ever seen. Yeah, it's real nice to like have stuff shut down and see Nazi flags and the bastardization of the American flag that is the Blue Lives Matter flag. That's really nice. Yeah, I love that sort of shit. And they're real nice to people who are their kind. So yeah, I'm sure you love them. And that's probably all I need to say, right? Mark, I've been thinking lately about what McIntyre says about the requisite virtues, courage, justice, truthfulness for a practice, and how many institutions are failing at preserving these, and it shows. Yeah, and actually, so what Mark is talking about there is deep in the heart of After Virtue, which is a really great work. Everybody should read it. Going back to the Rawls, everybody should probably read Rawls' Justice, A Theory of Justice. I almost said justice is fairness. That's just the sort of nutshell idea, but A Theory of Justice. But everybody should instead, if you don't read the Rawls, read McIntyre, read After Virtue. And McIntyre makes the case that institutions are not enough. We need to cultivate communities of inquiry, communities of developing virtue. And this has to happen every single generation, right? And communities can sicken and go the wrong direction. There's no guarantee to any of these things. And he identifies 3 virtues as particularly needed: truthfulness or honesty, something missing if you're a partisan, right? Because then you have to lie to yourself and others about, what you're actually doing. You can't take an objective view, justice not for you, but also for other people within the society. And courage, the courage to stand up against your own groups, to police your own. If you can't do that, if your courage is only directed against the enemy, you're not courageous. You're actually gutless. And that's a big problem in our political parties and communities. Massacre, when Canadian hogs wave the Confederate flags, we done messed up as a country. Yeah, and again, I'll say as a Wisconsinite, I think, and I'm going to write this up eventually, our tradition, our historical tradition is killing rebels, killing Confederates, right? If you go down Wisconsin Avenue, we have a Civil War statue, and it shows 3 Union soldiers trampling a Confederate rebel soldier into the dust who's been killed. That's our tradition. I think that anybody who has a Confederate flag on their car, on their shirt, they ought to be whipped. They ought to be beaten. They ought to have corporal punishment used against them. That flag ought to be burned, maybe covered with shit, because that's what it deserves. It's a sign just of devotion to racism and white power. And to see that in Wisconsin, to see that in Canada, which is where the Underground Railroad was going, shows that the level of corruption of the people who are racists in that country. It shouldn't be tolerated. It should be like Nazi memorabilia in Germany. If you use it, you get dinged. I think we should uphold our traditions of anti-racism and abolitionism, and being for the Union. Those are equally valid traditions for all those gross, disgusting, my history people who want to wave Confederate flags. We shouldn't give them the opportunity to claim history. We should have history coming down on them like a boot, You can tell I'm pretty passionate about that, but I've been thinking about that for years, Kirkland, interesting your point about work abolition in China. They believe they should build up the productive forces while safeguarding the socialist movement roughly. Yeah, maybe they do, maybe they don't. I remember how shocked I was at one of the recent party congresses, and this is back in the early 2000s, when the Communist Party said, we're not really so much about protecting the workers anymore. And I was like, holy shit, that's big. They just said that they're in charge. They're basically like going back to Mandarin China, where the elites rule, and they'll look out for the poor and the workers if they want to, but if not, too bad. It's not going to be the main focus. So I don't know. I wouldn't trust that sort of buying into things. All right. Let's see who else we've got here. Paul Lidier, I'm vaccinated but strongly opposed to mandates. Mandates are too politically volatile and will further increase partisanship. How can we balance public health and individual freedom of choice? Well, guess what? You can't. You can't balance what the people who are crazy call individual freedom of choice. You don't coddle them. You don't say, oh, they're going to get upset if we have a mandate. No, that's ridiculous. That's playing into their hands. We've tolerated enough stupid, nonsense bullshit from all these anti-vaxxers. We should actually have mandates. We should enforce mandates. And if they don't like it, screw them. The only reason we can't is because we can't trust the damn cops to actually enforce the law, because so many of them are nut job, right-winger anti-vaxxers, right? If we actually had a functioning society and decent people in police offices, we would have no problem enforcing mandates, but we don't. So there's no reason why we should be like namby-pamby about this and be, oh, we don't want to make them upset. They're already upset. They're nut jobs. You can't actually reason with them. So that's a non-starter as far as I'm concerned, JB Bell, Rawls' relative irrelevance in the current very hot context. Are there any other philosophers you think are helpful for these times. I like the Stoics, of course, but maybe more contemporary. I mean, I think the Stoics are actually quite useful when they're understood. All the Stoics were committed to their societies. That is a central part of it. They fought in civil wars. They were willing to be exiled. They actually did a plot against the Emperor Nero to get rid of him. This is the part of Stoicism that doesn't get brought out enough. It's all this stupid, like, scammy broicism. I'm going to be a tough guy at the gym and take cold showers bullshit, and they don't actually read the real Stoics and see what they did. I think there's a lot of potential there. I think, any sort of neo-Aristotelianism, and there's plenty of them out there like McIntyre, we could use that. I think that people who are influenced by them could be quite helpful as well. So, and we do have to address, I think we need to look at radical philosophy positions. We do have to address misogyny. We do have to address, longstanding patterns of racism that isn't just individual racism in a conscious way, but there is structural racism. We do need to address that sort of stuff instead of trying to hide it or, demonize it as CRT. They'll move on from that because last year it was postmodernism, and next year it'll be something different, right? All the people who are motivated solely by their own little fears, right? There's a lot that we could be using. All right. Christopher, any thoughts on the Supreme Court taking up affirmative action at universities? The last time we took it up was Sandra Day O'Connor, I think, wrote the majority view, and she said in about 20 years, we're going to have to revisit this. So it's probably a good time to revisit it, right? Here's an interesting point. Kirkland Day, Democrats stop progress and Republicans reverse it. And that's actually a pretty good way to talk about it. Republicans at this point in time, I've voted Republican in the past. I've actually, supported Republican candidates at the local level. It is disgusting what Republicans have allowed themselves to turn into. The incredible corruption and, all the sort of like worst parts of human nature and our political history coming to the fore and becoming central, and the Democrats, pretty ineffective. They're always getting like rope-a-doped by the Republicans. You're like, what is wrong with you people? And you get the idea that quite a few of them don't actually believe in any of the progressive things that they make claims about. And part of the problem is we do have a political elite. There's so much money to be made in being in charge. I mean, look at the Obamas and the Clintons, how rich they are. Were they that rich before office? No. We could plenty of other examples. So King Dolores really wants to be the contrarian here. Trump wasn't nearly as bad as the media made him. He was actually worse than the media made him. You just got to pay close attention. I'm not quite sure why you want to try to say things that are, again, it's almost like playing rope-a-dope, all right. Just skipped a little bit. Let's see who else we've got here. Theory Decule, can we have a segment on ignorance soon, as in people not knowing what they're talking about? I mean, why would we need a segment on that? That's perennial, right? Kirkland, if you look at the meeting between Trump and Kim Jong-un, the media and established figures were heavily critical. That was the most diplomacy seen from a U.S. president than ever before. I'm not even going to bother to try to address that. The most diplomacy ever before. Yeah, sure. Nixon and China, try that on. Wada, we need the philosopher, king, and queen. Now, wouldn't that be nice? But I don't think that complex societies really admit of that. And when have we seen that in history really working? We could say, oh, Marcus Aurelius, Frederick the Great had ambitions to be the philosopher king. It doesn't, well, actually, Queen Christina of Sweden, probably, that's why she wanted some tutorials from Descartes, who she brought up, and then he got sick and died. I don't see that as, it's sort of like when we've got this kind of simplistic thinking. If we only change the top leadership, everything would be better. No, because there's all sorts of other problems down below, and that's what brings people up into the top leadership, you know? So, all right. Kenneth Chin, thoughts on Joe Rogan backlash? I think Joe Rogan, I can never take Joe Rogan seriously. He's just the guy who made people eat bugs on Fear Factor, and somehow he captured a zeitgeist among people who, thought it was cool to like talk about alternative views. He's I don't take him seriously at all as a human being or a public intellectual, and I'd rather see him. He's not actually being canceled. If you can whine about cancel culture on other platforms, you're not canceled. I'd love to see him go away. I think he's actually a deleterious influence on American culture. Kirkland Day, another silly thing. The Ukraine crisis seems manufactured by America. U.S. says war is coming in a week. Yes, Ukraine says U.S. is overstepping and creating unnecessary tension. Yeah, I mean, manufactured. Anytime you've got like some big picture, easy, this is exactly what's happening thing, you're probably buying somebody else's misinformation. So you probably want to look at your sources where you're getting that stuff from. Chris, if anything, Rawls is less relevant today compared to, say, Raymond Goyce, who makes questions such as who, whom, that is, in any actual society, who has power, what do they use it for, who suffers as a result? Yeah, I mean, that's probably true. I mentioned Habermas. I've brought up Foucault here. There's plenty of people who are probably more relevant than Rawls. It's amazing how Rawls captured the political imagination for so long in American political theory. All right. Kirkland Day, obvious comparisons between Rome and Washington. People love to do, what about ancient Rome? That's silly too. We're much more like, I've said this many, many times. You want to read a book that will actually give you an idea about where we are. Willem Shirer's the fall of the French Third Republic. He's much more famous for the rise and fall of the Third Reich. The conditions that we're seeing in America, the political gridlock, the overspending on a military that we use in wrong ways, all those sorts of things, quite similar to what is going on in France leading up to their fall to the Nazis in the 1940s. So it's sort of an old, chestnut, we're like ancient Rome. No, we're not like ancient Rome. That's really not what's going on. All right. Anti-Gaia, doesn't libertarianism basically just end up in a monarchy anyway if you take it all the way? It shouldn't. I mean, libertarianism, if it really stays true to itself, and I think a lot of libertarians are not true to their own libertarianism because they really are in it for some other reason. There should be like a continual like bargaining going on between people about how power is going to be used, and the government should be relatively small. So, all right. Bien le bonjour. I feel politics is but a masquerade today because that most citizens are super uneducated about the world, so they cannot express in thoughtful opinion a functioning collaborative system we need. This is a big problem here in America. And, anybody who's trying to like restrain education so it can't talk about certain topics is probably contributing to that. We have incredible innumeracy and functional illiteracy. People aren't media literate. They buy into things all too easily. And we need better citizens in order to have, in general, in order to have a functioning society. But I am not super optimistic about that. Tom, I'm a Canadian who has numerous friends in Ottawa. Trust me, this has been far from a nice protest. Local residents have been unrelentingly harassed. Yeah, I mean, that's evident to those of us who are paying attention outside of Canada, All right. Let's see who else we have. Jonathan says, how are you analyzing the Ukraine crisis currently? I'm not analyzing it. I'm just watching it. I'm watching to see how it plays out. Seems like Russia wants to use it to, whip up nationalist fervor and distract its citizens, as it's been doing for a long time, from how how many problems there are in Russia. So yeah, let's see here. I'm gonna have to get going pretty soon. We'll see if there's anything good here and in the things. Northern Bohemian realist. I grew up in Chippewa Falls, now live in DeForest. You're correct about the progressive history of our state. Yeah, I mean, I wouldn't say it if I didn't know that that was the case. I've actually done some research on our sixth governor, Alexander Randall, who's the guy who actually wanted to have Wisconsin secede from the Union if Lincoln wasn't elected. Right? It wasn't secession and states' rights wasn't just a thing for the Southerners, right? I'm gonna have to get going pretty soon because my daughter and I are gonna be spending some time together. My oldest daughter up here at UWM. OSH, how do you feel about the normalization of racism in parts of the world outside of the neoliberal paradigm, like in Turkey, much of South America, Russia, Japan? I'm against racism. I think racism is inherently evil, and people who want to justify it and are invested in that really need to look at their own character and their own justifications why they would deliberately prioritize something like that. That's usually because of their own damage and trauma. Sometimes it's because they're bad people, and are they as bad as other people who are also doing other bad things? Maybe not. Depends on the case, right? There's all sorts of gradations, but racism in general is bad, and when we eventually get past it, as we do, either we get past it or we don't, but the grand historical arc has been getting past silly, stupid bullshit that people wanted to buy into. I know there's a lot of regression going on right now, but we can look forward to a time when maybe that's not going to be how people divide up the world, and damage themselves. Anti-gay, you shouldn't be allowed to keep your kid from getting the vaccine. That's where it irritates me. Yeah, you can't keep your kids from getting the vaccines for other stuff. Although there are, all the stupid I don't want to get my kid inoculated for measles. There's actually people nowadays, the anti-vax thing has gone so far, people get injured and they won't take a tetanus shot. That's how stupid or crazy some of this anti-vax stuff has gotten. If you're not going to get your kids vaccinated, maybe you don't get to participate in society. I'm perfectly fine with that sort of thing. That seems reasonable to me. Thomas Gerard, Abraham Lincoln, philosopher, statesman. Yeah, somebody who I think is quite good. Bede, as an Ottawan with no real dog in the fight of the protests, it's immensely frustrating to see the co-opting of American revolutionary symbols, most notably the Gadsden flag. 1776 never happened here. That's right. The people who are flying that sort of stuff don't even know their own history, and they're trying to import something. It would be as if we were the Republicans basically should just import Russian flags because a lot of them are in the pocket of the Russians, including our Senator Ron Johnson here in Wisconsin, who I hope to God gets voted out, right? It's very transgressive. It's not something, good to be bringing these sorts of things in. All right. R.T. Whitby, Joe Rogan isn't a public intellectual, never claimed to be. You don't have to claim to be one. I mean, he's the sort of bottom of the barrel is what we've got, Let's see who else we can take too. So there's some questions here from Wada about the Electoral College. It streamlines the voting process. It protects the country from herd mentality. But it seems every election it's in the news for being archaic and artifact of an old system. Yeah, the Electoral College is just crap. I mean, it's outlived its purpose. We can't really fix it, unfortunately, because of our political gridlock, but we need something better, And I mean, right now, it really benefits a minority to try to rule. So, and how would you replace it? Probably with something more like a parliamentary system where there's closer direct representation. Oh, here's a good question from OSH. I wouldn't consider myself politically literate. As such, I don't try to have opinions on politics. People say I'm morally wrong for my willful quietness. I don't think you're morally wrong. I mean, it is important as a citizen to develop some degree of political literacy, but I don't. I actually think if you don't know much about something, you're probably better off not just like picking an idea out of the air and saying I'm going to run with this, right? We've already got enough people like that. So, all right. Chris says it looks like the right is in a cul-de-sac with wanting lesser public spending, such as education. How can a democracy sustain itself from corruption if the people have been corrupted as well? Those two different issues, right? The right is not actually for less government or less spending. They just want to control it. I mean, that's pretty clear because as soon as they get the chance to rule, they don't actually. I mean, they are for privatization, and that usually means privatizing to their cronies, their buddies, the people that they went to school with, and stuff like that. But that's still keeping it within the political system, right? It's still money going to somebody to do something. So I don't think that. I think that the right in the past and the Republican Party in the past was for small government. They haven't been for small government since the Bush era. We saw a massive expansion of government, in part because of the war on terror. Even Reagan wasn't consistent on that. He was for like deregulation when he wanted to, but not for other things. You know, he played off of that anti-government rhetoric, but he didn't really live up to it all that much. All right, Pumba, this whole thing hits home for me, the terrifying notion of confirmation bias or maybe group identification. I mean, so here's the good news, and this is what I'll end on because I'm a little bit over time. What we're going through is not radically new. People act like a-holes all the time throughout all history. All you got to do is, spend some time, looking at other eras, other places, and you see that there's, people exploiting the political process. There's corruption going on. There's groups that come up with crazy ideas and then push it onto their membership and all sorts of factions and stuff like that. I mentioned Hobbes is seeing an English Civil War play out and writing books about it. By the way, he has a book about the English Civil War called Behemoth. That's the companion piece to Leviathan. So things are not great. Things are actually, in many respects, and for many people, particularly those who are easy to victimize, those who lack power, who lack prestige, who lack money, who have been historically marginalized or discriminated against, things are hard for them, very hard for them, and unfairly hard, right? But this is not unprecedented. We've figured out as human beings how to get through this before. Now, of course, we have some other significant challenges, the climate change issue, which is very easy to see. You just look outside here in Wisconsin, and you can tell that climate change has taken place. And we're not able to really do much about that. We have some other looming problems on the horizon, but it's not the end of the world, right? People have been screw-ups for a long time. Politics, when it's working well, is trying to figure out how to make this work, how to, not arrive at ideal, perfect solutions, but workable solutions that can make people's lives better, that can restore some justice to where it's lacking. So that's what I'll end on. Thanks for everybody for your questions and comments. And we'll do this again next month. I'll figure out a good topic for next month and got some other online events happening. I'll see you later on.